troops begin fighting in World War II?
Late in 1942, the United States sent its first troops across the Atlantic, making amphibious landings in North Africa, followed by Sicily and the Italian peninsula. The first Allied landings were in Morocco, Casablanca, and Algeria, Oran and Algiers, on November 8 of that year. Algiers became the Allied headquarters in North Africa for the duration of the war. The combined forces of the initial landing included more than 100,000 troops. Launching the American military effort in the Atlantic theater of conflict. One American newspaper headline announced, "Yanks invade Africa." Was the U.S.
What was the Embargo Act?
On December 22, 1807, President Thomas Jefferson, 1743–1826, signed the Embargo Act, prohibiting ships that were destined for foreign ports from leaving the United States. The legislation had been drawn up in an effort to pressure France and Britain, which were then at war and had been seizing U.S. merchant ships to prevent each other from receiving American goods. The situation began after the French Navy was crushed by the British under Admiral Horatio Nelson. 1758–1805, at the Battle of Trafalgar, October 1805. French ruler Napoleon Bonaparte, 1769–1821, turned to economic warfare in his long struggle with the British, directing all countries under French control not to trade with Britain. Its economy dependent on trade, Britain struck back by imposing a naval blockade on France, which soon interfered with U.S. shipping. Ever since the struggle between the two European powers had begun in 1793, the United States had tried to remain neutral. But the interruption of shipping to and from the continent and the search and seizure of ships posed significant problems to the American export business. The Embargo Act was an attempt to solve these problems without getting involved in the conflict. But the effort failed. The embargo made sales of U.S. farm surpluses impossible. New England shippers protested the act and were joined by Southern cotton and tobacco planters in their opposition. Nevertheless, the embargo remained in effect for 14 months, during which the American economy suffered and many ships resorted to smuggling. In 1809, Congress passed the Non-Intercourse Act, which limited the shipping embargo to France and Britain. All other foreign ports were again open to U.S. ships. 3 years later, the United States was drawn into the conflict, fighting the British in the War of 1812–14.
How did the Renaissance spread from Italy to the rest of Europe?
Eventually, the ideas born in Italy during the 1300s spread northward. which is at least in part attributable to German inventor Johannes Gutenberg's printing press, c. 1440 to 1450, before long, the spirit and ideas that were taking hold in Italy reached France. Germany, England, and the Netherlands, where the Renaissance continued into the 1600s. One of the most important figures of the Northern Renaissance was the Dutch humanist Desiderius Erasmus, c. 1466 to 1536, whose book In Praise of Folly 1509, is a blistering criticism of the clergy, scholars, and philosophers of his day. Another notable figure of the Northern Renaissance was Englishman Sir Thomas More. 1478 to 1535, who was a statesman and advisor to the king. More's Utopia, published in 1516, criticizes the times by envisioning an ideal society in which land is communally held, men and women alike are educated. Police are unnecessary, politicians are honest, and where there is religious tolerance. The works of Flemish artist Jan van Eyck, 1395 to 1441, including his groundbreaking portrait Man in a Red Turban. 1433, demonstrate that the principles of the Renaissance were felt as strongly in Northern Europe as they were in Italy.
What happened to the Ostrogoths?
The eastern division of the Goths, the Ostrogoths, were overrun and absorbed by the Huns in 370. When the powerful Hun leader, Attila, died in 453. Subjects of the Huns revolted and the Ostrogoths regained their freedom. Theodoric, c. 454 to 526, became the ruler of the Ostrogoths in 493, and it was under his leadership that the group invaded northern Italy, where they remained. In the middle of the following century, they were overthrown by the armies of the Byzantine Empire. Like other Germanic tribes, the Ostrogoths were absorbed into the various groups of Europe.
Who were the barbarians?
The term is used to refer to any of the Germanic tribes that, during the middle of the first millennium A.D., beginning about 400, repeatedly attacked Rome, eventually conquering it and dividing the territories of the West Roman Empire into many kingdoms. While what was the East Roman Empire survived as the Byzantine Empire. The Germanic tribes included the Goths, the Vandals, the Franks, and the Lombards.
What is black gold?
Black gold is a term for oil or petroleum black because of its appearance when it comes out of the ground. And gold because it made prospectors, drillers, and oil industry men rich. The oil industry in the United States began in 1859 when retired railroad conductor Edwin L. Drake, 1819 to 1880, drilled a well near Titusville, Pennsylvania. His drill, powered by an old steam engine, struck oil. Oil from animal tallow and whales had been used as a lubricant since colonial times. The discovery of a process for deriving kerosene, a clean-burning and easy-lighting fuel from coal oil, had been patented in 1854. After Drake's Titusville well produced shale oil. The substance was analyzed for its properties and it, too, was determined to be an excellent source of kerosene. Soon others began prospecting for rock oil. Western Pennsylvania became an important oil-producing region. Wagons and river barges transported barrels to market. Later, the railroad reached into the region. And by 1875 a pipeline was built to carry the oil directly to Pittsburgh. Petroleum products soon replaced whale oil as a fluid for illumination. During the 1880s, Ohio, Kentucky, Illinois, and Indiana also produced oil. In 1901 the famous Spindletop field in eastern Texas produced the nation's first gusher. Oil literally sprang out of the earth. During the next decade, California and Oklahoma joined Texas to lead the nation's oil production. Between 1859 and 1900, U.S. oil production boomed. Just 2,000 barrels were produced the year it was discovered in Pennsylvania. More than 64 million barrels were produced annually by the turn of the century. The second half of the 1800s saw the oil industry boom. The fuel was used for lighting, heating, and lubrication, principally of machinery and tools. But the advent of the automobile and its central role in the life of 20th century America made the oil industry richer yet. Demand soon exceeded the nation's supply of petroleum, prompting the United States to increasingly rely on imported oil for fuel.
What is Golgotha?
Golgotha is the Hebrew name for Calvary. The site on a hillside outside ancient Jerusalem where Jesus Christ, c. 6 BCE AD 30, was crucified. Though the exact site is unknown. It is believed to be where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is located.
Who started the Underground Railroad?
American abolitionist, lecturer, and nurse Harriet Tubman, c. 1820 to 1913, set up the network to emancipate slaves. Tubman was motivated to do so after she had made her way to freedom in 1849, and then wished the same for her family. I had crossed the line of which I had so long been dreaming. I was free, but there was no one to welcome me to the land of freedom. For the next 10 years Tubman acted as a conductor on the Underground Railroad, making at least 15 trips into southern slave states, and guiding not only her parents and siblings, but more than 300 slaves to freedom in the North. She was called the Moses of her people for her emancipation efforts. The journeys to freedom were demanding and often dangerous missions. Though Tubman was small in stature, she possessed extraordinary leadership qualities. Author, clergyman, and Army officer Thomas Wentworth Higginson. 1823 to 1911, called her the greatest heroine of the age.
What was Goethe's contribution to world literature?
Johann Wolfgang Goethe, 1749 to 1832, is considered Germany's greatest writer. He also was a scientist, artist, musician, and philosopher. As a writer, Goethe experimented with many genres and literary styles. And his works became a shaping force of the major German literary movements of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. His masterwork, the poetic drama Faust, 1808, rewritten 1832, embodies the author's humanistic ideal of a world literature, one that transcends the boundaries of nations and historical periods. Indeed, the story of Faust, a German astrologer, magician, and soothsayer, c. 1480 to 1540, remains one of universal interest, and has been treated often in both literature and music. The legendary figure was believed to have sold his soul to the devil in exchange for the opportunity to experience all of life's pleasures.
What was the Nanking Massacre?
One of the most brutal chapters in modern history, the Nanking Massacre, also called the Rape of Nanking, was a mass execution of hundreds of thousands of unarmed Chinese civilians by invading Japanese soldiers in December 1937 and January 1938. No one knows for certain how many people were murdered in the mass killings, but most estimates place the number at 300,000, with another 80,000 people raped and tortured, including women and children. On December 13, 1937, the Japanese Royal Army swept into the eastern Chinese city of Nanking, today called Nanjing, which was then the capital of China. In the weeks that followed, the Japanese soldiers went on an orgy of violence. The atrocities were documented on film by the Japanese themselves as well as by helpless foreigners in the city at the time of the seizure. Surviving photos show unimaginable cruelties. It is believed that Japan's military had been trained to carry out the killings and atrocities in order to make an example of Nanking to other Chinese people, thereby facilitating Japan's intended occupation. The horrific event was the source of recent controversy stirred by the 1997 publication of The Rape of Nanking, The Forgotten Holocaust of World War II by Iris Chang. 1968, a historian and journalist whose grandparents narrowly escaped the massacre. Unlike Germany, which accepted responsibility for the Holocaust of Jews during World War II. 1939 to 45, and whose Nazi leaders were tried in number at Nuremberg. Japan never acknowledged its crimes committed at Nanking. After World War II, only a few of Japan's military leaders were tried and found guilty of war crimes related to the taking of Nanking. This chapter in Japan's national history has been largely denied by its officials, some of whom accused Chiang of issuing propaganda. Chiang stood by her research, which included interviews with survivors, as well as with Japanese soldiers who participated in the violence. The massacre remains a deeply divisive event between the two nations and their people.
What was the nonviolence movement?
The Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. 1929 to 1968, was committed to bringing about change by staging peaceful protests. He led a campaign of nonviolence as part of the civil rights movement. King rose to prominence as a leader during the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955, when he delivered a speech that embodied his Christian beliefs and set the tone for the nonviolence movement, saying, "We are not here advocating violence. The only weapon we have is the weapon of protest." Throughout his life, King staunchly adhered to these beliefs even after terrorists bombed his family's home. King's arsenal of democratic protest included boycotts, marches. The words of his stirring speeches, comprising an impressive body of oratory, and sit-ins. With other African American ministers, King established the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. 1957, which assumed a leadership role during the civil rights movement. The nonviolent protest of Black Americans proved a powerful weapon against segregation and discrimination. A massive demonstration in Birmingham, Alabama, in 1963 helped sway public opinion and motivate lawmakers in Washington to act when news coverage of the event showed peaceful protesters being subdued by policemen using dogs and heavy fire hoses. In response to the outcry over the event in Birmingham, President John F. Kennedy, 1917 to 1963, proposed civil rights legislation to Congress. The bill was passed in 1964. That same year, Martin Luther King Jr. received the Nobel Peace Prize for his nonviolent activism. King's policy of peace was challenged 2 years later when the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, tired of the violent response with which peaceful protesters were often met, urged activists to adopt a more decisive and aggressive stance and began promoting the slogan Black Power. The civil rights movement, having made critical strides, became fragmented, as leaders, including the highly influential Malcolm X, 1925 to 1965, differed over how to effect change. On April 4, 1968, King was in Memphis, Tennessee, to show his support for a strike of black sanitation workers when he was gunned down outside his hotel room shortly after 5:30 in the evening. As news of King's death swept over the nation, blacks in 168 American cities and towns responded with rioting. setting fire to buildings, and looting white businesses. Commenting on the terror, radical African American leader Stokely Carmichael said, "When white America killed Dr. King last night, she declared war on us." The chaos continued for a week. When the rioting ended on April 11, there were 46 dead. Most of them black, 35,000 injured, and 20,000 jailed. Nevertheless, the violent crime that claimed the leader's life and the violence that erupted after news spread of his death have not, decades later, overshadowed King's legacy of peace and his message of the brotherhood of all people.
What were fiefs?
A fief was an estate that was owned, governed, and protected by a lord. A fief consisted of several manors, each of which might have had its own lord, and their villages, along with all buildings on the land as well as the peasants, serfs, who worked the land, served at court, or took up arms on behalf of the lord. The lord of the fief, called a feudal lord, would secure the allegiance of the manorial lords, sometimes called seigneurs, who would in turn secure the allegiance of the peasants. In short, land was exchanged for loyalty. This was feudalism. The political and economic system of the Middle Ages, 500-1350. The word feud is of Germanic origin and means fee. In repayment for the land they lived on and for the protection they received from the lord, serfs were expected to pay the lord fees in the form of money, taxes, services, or goods. The feudal system arose in the 7th century. It was suspended during the Carolingian Empire, which began in 751 when a series of powerful kings, including Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, 742 to 814, united much of Western Europe. But after Charlemagne died in 814, his grandsons fought each other and later divided the vast kingdom among themselves. Each of their territories later came under attack, dissolving Carolingian rule. By the 9th century, feudalism had replaced the Carolingian Empire as the political and economic entity governing medieval life. Feudalism lasted into the 15th century.
What was the charge up San Juan Hill?
On July 1, 1898, during the Spanish-American War, Colonel Theodore Roosevelt, 1858-1919, led his American troops, known as the Rough Riders, on an attack of the Spanish blockhouse, a small fort, on San Juan Hill, near Santiago, Cuba. Newspaper reports made Roosevelt and the Rough Riders into celebrities. And even after he became a U.S. president, Teddy Roosevelt remarked that San Juan was the great day of my life. San Juan Hill was part of a two-pronged assault on Santiago. while the Rough Riders Regiment attacked the Spanish defenses at San Juan and Kettle Hills. Another American division, led by General Henry Lawton, 1843–1899, captured the Spanish fort at El Caney. The success of the two initiatives on July 1 combined to give the Americans command over the ridges surrounding Santiago. By July 3 the American forces had destroyed the Spanish fleet. Under the command of Admiral Pascual Cervera Whiteapete, 1839–1909. On July 17 the Spanish surrendered the city. Though the victory was critical to the outcome of the war, the assault on Kettle Hill and San Juan Hill had come at a high price. 1,600 American lives were lost. In a battle that had seen American troops black and white fight the Spanish shoulder to shoulder.
What was the impact of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan?
When the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in December 1979 to bolster a pro-communist government in the Middle Eastern nation, no one could have anticipated the far-reaching effects that would be felt decades later and around the globe. What immediately followed was a 10-year civil war, in which Soviet troops fought Afghan guerrillas, or the Mujahideen. The war in Afghanistan became a jihad, or holy war, and a rallying point for many Muslims, with the conflict drawing young men from across the Muslim world to fight on the side of the guerrillas. According to the 9/11 Commission report, mosques, schools, and boarding houses served as recruiting stations in many parts of the world, including the United States. The war was a virtual stalemate for 7 years. But a turning point came in 1986 after the United States and Great Britain supplied shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles to the Afghan guerrillas. The weaponry gave the scrubby ground forces a fighting chance against Soviet air power. As the 9/11 Commission report asserts, together with Saudi Arabia, the United States supplied billions of dollars worth of secret assistance to rebel Afghan groups resisting the Soviet occupation. Thus supported, in April 1988 the Afghans declared victory. And early the next year the Soviet troops began to withdraw. The war was over, but it had fueled an extremist Islamic ideology, the jihad as holy war, and put into place an infrastructure out of which emerged a powerful and deadly terrorist network. Though most Muslims hold peaceful views, a minority of Muslims view any non-Muslims as unbelievers. It was from this minority, trained and financed as a result of the Afghan war, that the global network of terrorists called Al-Qaeda emerged.
How has MTV affected the music industry?
MTV's almost immediate impact was to launch the music careers of fledgling artists. Some critics believe that superstar Madonna, who showed up on the music scene at about the same time as MTV, would not have risen to the heights of fame that she has were it not for music television. Or at least her star might not have risen so quickly. But she and other media-savvy artists exploited the new format to reach the music-buying public the world over, for soon MTV had a global presence. The video channel also gave established artists a boost by airing more than one single off a given album, resulting in several hits from any one recording. Such was the case for artists like Billy Joel, Bruce Springsteen, U2, and Peter Gabriel. Increasingly creative videos gave the works of album-oriented musicians longer lives and steady sales. MTV quickly established itself and the format as an integral part of the music industry. Once the format was proven viable, other music television channels emerged, including VH1, which was begun by media mogul Ted Turner and was later bought by MTV and molded into an adult-oriented music station. The Nashville Network, TNN, which aired country music videos and programming in the 1980s and 1990s, and country music television, CMT. Today, the music video remains an important tool for new and established artists alike. Media analysts also believe MTV has had an impact on modern culture. Since the channel relies on interesting visuals to capture viewing audiences, MTV is constantly upping the creative ante for artists who freely experiment with bright colors, images, rapid-fire editing, motifs, dreamlike imagery, and other visual techniques, which began showing up on other television shows, in movies, and in advertising. Some observers believe the phenomenon has ushered in a new visual order. Of course, MTV has its detractors. Critics argue that the MTV aesthetic is superficial, and that it is accelerating the movement away from traditional forms of literacy. While MTV is praised and panned in the worldwide media, there's no arguing that the music channel continues to be a window on what's hip and hot to the American youth.
Why is Descartes considered the father of modern philosophy?
French mathematician and philosopher René Descartes, 1596 to 1650, was living in Holland in 1637 when he published his first major work, Discourse on Method. In this treatise, he extends mathematical methods to science and philosophy, asserting that all knowledge is the product of clear reasoning based on self-evident premises. This idea, that there are certitudes, provided the foundation for modern philosophy, which dates from the 1600s to the present. Descartes may be best known for the familiar phrase "I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum," in Latin. This assertion is based on his theory that only one thing cannot be doubted, and that is doubt itself. The next logical conclusion is that the doubter, thinker, must, therefore, exist. The correlation to the dictum "I think, therefore I am," is dualism, the doctrine that reality consists of mind and matter. Since the thinker thinks and is, he or she is both mind, idealism, and body, matter, or material. Descartes concluded that mind and body are independent of each other. And he formulated theories about how they work together. Modern philosophers have often concerned themselves with the question of dualism. Descartes' other major works include Meditations on First Philosophy, 1641, which is his most famous, and Principles of Philosophy, 1644. His philosophy became known as Cartesianism, from Cartesius, the Latin form of his name.
What were newsreels?
Newsreels got their start in 1910 when the pioneer film newsreel Path Gazette was shown in Britain and the United States. French cinematographer Charles Path, 1863 to 1957, and his brother Émile, 1860 to 1937, were Paris agents for the Edison phonograph. They visited London to acquire filmmaking equipment and secured financial support in order to set up production units in Britain, the United States, Italy, Germany, Russia, and Japan. These short movies, covering current events, were predominantly used during wartime and were shown in theaters before motion pictures were shown. Superseded by television newscasts, the last newsreels were screened in 1967.
What was the impact of the fire at the MGM Grand in Las Vegas?
The November 21, 1980, blaze, which killed 85 people and injured more than 600, led to a nationwide revision of local fire codes, giving the tragic event large-scale political significance. The MGM Grand Hotel had, in fact, passed fire inspections, but the building, which was then the world's largest gambling casino, had been 8 years in the making. Between the time it was designed, fire protection systems included, and the time it was built, the building no longer complied with the always improving safety standard for high-rise buildings. A short circuit started the blaze, which sent thick black smoke through the air ducts and escape stairwells. In the 21 floors of guest rooms, since more people were harmed or killed by smoke inhalation than by the fire itself, the American public became aware of the danger of smoke over and above that of fire. The event was a catalyst for change. Prior to the November blaze, most communities had not required existing buildings to be retrofitted every time fire safety codes changed and improved. After the fire, many communities chose to require building owners to comply with current protection capabilities.
What was the Trail of Tears?
The Trail of Tears was the government-enforced western migration of the American Indians, which began March 25, 1838. As an increasing number of white settlers moved inland from the coastal areas, They laid claim to Indian homelands, conflicts ensued. The government's solution was to relocate the Indians to make room for the pioneers. As many as 17,000 members of the Cherokee Nation were forced from tribal lands in Georgia, Alabama, and Tennessee, and were escorted west by federal troops under the command of General Winfield Scott. 1786 to 1866, along an 800-mile trail that followed the Tennessee-Ohio, Mississippi, and Arkansas rivers to Indian Territory in Oklahoma, north of the Red River. The journey took between 93 and 139 days, and the movement westward was called the Trail of Tears, not only because it was a journey the native people did not wish to make, to a place where they did not wish to go, but because an estimated 4,000 people, mostly infants, children, and the elderly, died en route. The deaths were caused by sickness, including measles, whooping cough, pneumonia, and tuberculosis. Escorted in waves, it was a full year, spring of 1839, before the Cherokee had been relocated. Some 1,000 had refused to leave their tribal lands in the southeast. The forced migration thus resulted in the fragmentation and weakening of the tribe.
Who was Eugene Debs?
Debs, 1855 to 1926, was a radical labor leader who in 1893 founded the American Railway Union. ARU, an industrial union for all railroad workers. Debs was a charismatic speaker, but he was also a controversial figure in American life around the turn of the century. In 1894, workers at the Pullman Palace Car Company, which manufactured rail cars in Pullman, Illinois, near Chicago, went on strike to protest a significant reduction in their wages. Pullman was a model company town where the railcar manufacturer, founded by American inventor George W. Pullman, 1831 to 1897, in 1867, owned all the land and buildings, and ran the school, bank, and utilities. In 1893, in order to maintain profits following declining revenues, the Pullman Company cut workers' wages by 25 to 40%, but did not adjust rent and prices in the town, forcing many employees and their families into deprivation. In May 1894, a labor committee approached Pullman Company management to resolve the situation. The company, which had always refused to negotiate with employees, responded by firing the labor committee members. The firings incited a strike of all 3,300 Pullman workers. In support of the labor effort, Eugene Debs assumed leadership of the strike. Some Pullman employees had joined the ARU in 1894, and directed all ARU members not to haul any Pullman cars. A general rail strike followed, which paralyzed transportation across the country. In response to what was now being called Debs Rebellion, a July 2, 1894, federal court order demanded all workers to return to the job, but the ARU refused to comply. U.S. President Grover Cleveland, 1837 to 1908, ordered federal troops to break the strike, citing it interfered with mail delivery. The intervention turned violent. Despite public protest, Debs, who was tried for contempt of court and conspiracy, was imprisoned in 1895 for having violated the court order. Debs later proclaimed himself a socialist and became leader of the American left, running unsuccessfully for president as the Socialist Party candidate 5 times. In 1900, 1904, 1908, 1912, and 1920. He actively supported the causes of the international workers of the world. IWW, a radical labor organization founded in 1905.
What prompted widespread Irish emigration in the mid-1800s?
In 1845 Ireland's potato crop failed. Though crop failures in Europe were widespread at the time, the blight in Ireland was particularly hard-hitting because of the reliance on a single crop, potatoes, as the primary source of sustenance. The Great Famine that resulted lasted until 1848. The effect was a drastic decline in the Irish population due both to deaths and to emigration. Between 700,000 and 1 million people died in Ireland during the Great Famine. And between 1846 and 1854 alone, 1.75 million left the country in search of a better life elsewhere. 3/4 of those were headed to the United States. In the years after the Great Famine, experts determined that the blight of the late 1840s was caused by a fungus that was probably introduced to Ireland by a ship from North America, where there had been crop failures in the early 1840s. Sad irony that the very conduit that had likely borne the blight from North America to Ireland also carried immigrating Irish back to North American shores.
Why is Milton important to English literature?
Except for Shakespeare, the works of John Milton, 1608 to 1674, have been the subject of more commentary than those of any other English writer. Milton is considered one of only a few writers to take their place in the small circle of great epic writers. According to Norton Anthology of English Literature, in Milton's writings two tremendous intellectual and social movements come to a head. The movements referred to are the Renaissance and the Reformation. Scholars point to Milton's use of classical references and the rich tapestry of his works as being Renaissance in nature, while his earnest and individually minded Christianity are resonant of the Reformation. For example, in his masterpiece Paradise Lost, 1667, Milton, like poets Homer and Virgil before him, takes on humankind's entire experience, war, love, religion, hell, heaven, and the cosmos. But rather than having Adam triumph over evil through an act of heroism, he accepts the burden of worldly existence, and triumphs over his guilt by admitting it and repenting it. In addition to his famous epics, Milton wrote sonnets and other short poems, including on Shakespeare, El Allegro, Il Penseroso, and Lycidas. His writings also include political discourse, chief of which is the essay Areopagitica, 1644. Among the ideas that Milton championed were the limitation of the monarchy, dethroning of bishops, freedom of speech, and the institution of divorce. One commentator mused that the guarantees of freedom in the United States Constitution owe more to Milton's Areopagitica than to John Locke.
Who were the Goths?
The Goths were a group of Germanic tribes who originated in what is now Scandinavia. As early as the 3rd century AD, the Goths invaded the eastern provinces of the Roman Empire. During the following century, they divided into two groups, a western group known as the Visigoths, who predominated north of the lower Danube River, in Central Europe, and an eastern group known as the Ostrogoths, who were situated north of the Black Sea, between Europe and Asia. Along with other tribal Germanic peoples, the Goths brought the downfall of the Roman Empire.
How did Joan of Arc become a warrior?
Joan of Arc, called the Maid of Orleans, c. 1412 to 1431, gained fame for leading the French into victory over the English in the battle for Orleans in 1429. A year before the battle, the English forces had invaded northern France and took possession of an area that included the city of Reims, where all of France's kings were crowned in the cathedral. Thus, Charles VII, 1403 to 1461, whom France recognized as their king, had never had a proper coronation. It is said that Joan, an extraordinarily devoted Catholic who was then just a teen, appealed to Charles to allow her to go into battle against the English who were besieging Orleans. Though he was skeptical of her at first, she claimed to have heard the voices of saints, he eventually conceded. In the battlefield, Joan also overcame the doubts of the French troops and their leaders, who were understandably hesitant to follow the young girl's lead. She proved to them that she was not only capable but also successful. In April 1429, in just 10 days' time, Joan led the French to victory over the English, who fled Orleans. Still determined to see Charles properly crowned, Joan proceeded to lead a military escort for the king into Reims, where he was at last coronated on July 17, 1429, with Joan of Arc standing beside him. Next she determined that Charles should authorize her to try to free Paris from English control. Again the king acquiesced, but this time with dire results. She was captured by the French Burgundians, English sympathizers and loyalists, who turned her over to the English. Believing she was a heretic, by all reports Joan of Arc was clairvoyant, the English burned her at the stake in Rouen. France, on May 30, 1431. She is still considered a national hero of France. Recognizing Joan of Arc for her unswerving faith and for having valiantly pursued what she believed her mission to be. The Catholic Church canonized Joan of Arc in 1920. The feast day of St. Joan of Arc is celebrated on May 30th.
What was the germ theory?
The germ theory, established in the mid-1800s, posited that certain germs cause diseases. Refuting the ages-old notion of spontaneous generation. The idea was first put forth by French chemist and microbiologist Louis Pasteur. 1822 to 1895, in a paper he published in 1861. His research, and that of German physician Robert Koch. 1843 to 1910, eventually substantiated the germ theory as fact. They proved that the microbe, or germ, is a living organism that can cause disease. Koch was even able to isolate certain bacteria as the causes of particular diseases, including anthrax, for which he published a method of preventive inoculation. Tuberculosis, cholera, and rinderpest, a cattle disease. The anthrax germ was the first germ linked to a particular disease by Koch in 1876. By the end of the 1800s, researchers had discovered the kinds of bacteria and other microbes responsible for the plague. Diphtheria, dysentery, gonorrhea, leprosy, malaria, pneumonia, tetanus, and other infectious diseases.
What are the divisions of the Hebrew Bible?
The Hebrew Bible is divided into three main sections called the Law, or Torah, the Prophets, and the Writings, or Hagiographa. The Hebrew Bible is accepted by Jews as sacred. The word testament comes from the ancient word testamentum, meaning covenant with God. Much of the Hebrew Bible recounts Jewish history, demonstrating faithful observance to their agreement with God. The law consists of those 5 books written by Moses, and these recount creation, early traditions, the lives of the patriarchs of Israel, early events of the Israelites, and entrance into the Promised Land. Torah translates as teaching, and Jews, as do Christians. Look to these first 5 books of the Bible for guidance. The prophets consists of the books of the former prophets, books of Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings, and the latter prophets. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the teachings of 12 other prophets. The books of the prophets chronicle historical events. But according to the Jewish tradition, these books also teach that people must obey God's laws. The writings consist of 13 books, which are believed to have been written by poets and teachers.
What caused the War of 1812?
The war between the young United States and powerful Great Britain largely came about because of France. After the French navy was crushed by the British under Admiral Nelson. 1758 to 1805, at the Battle of Trafalgar, Napoleon turned to economic warfare in his long struggle with the British. He directed all countries under French control not to trade with Great Britain. Its economy dependent on trade, Britain struck back by imposing a naval blockade on France, which soon interfered with U.S. shipping. Ever since the struggle between the two European powers began in 1793, the United States tried to remain neutral. But the interruption of shipping to and from the continent and the search and seizure of ships posed significant problems to the American export business. In 1807, Great Britain had issued an order in council that required even neutral vessels destined for a continental port to stop first in England. Napoleon countered with the Milan Decree, which stated that any neutral vessel that had submitted to British search be seized. Back in America, the people of New England, the region most dependent on shipping, nevertheless vehemently opposed entering into war with the British. But the country's economy was depressed as a result of the interruption of exports, and the U.S. Congress declared war on June 18, 1812. In these days before telegraph and radio, the United States did not know that 2 days before, on June 16, Britain had withdrawn its orders in council, lifting its policy of shipping interference, which had been the chief reason for the war declaration. Thus the two countries engaged in fighting for the next 2.5 years. On December 24, 1814, the Treaty of Ghent officially ended the war. But once again, poor communication led to fighting, 2 weeks after the treaty was signed. Troops in New Orleans, unaware of this event, fought for control over the Mississippi River in the worst battle of the entire conflict. Though both the United States and Great Britain claimed victory in the War of 1812, neither side had gained anything.
What was the Battle of Tippecanoe?
The battle near present-day Lafayette, Indiana, took place on November 7, 1811, when U.S. troops under the command of General William Henry Harrison, 1773 to 1841, defeated the Shawnee Indians while their leader, Tecumseh, 1768 to 1813, was away. Before the November battle, the Shawnee Indians had been steadily pushed back from their ancestral lands along the Cumberland River in Kentucky. Once they settled in the Ohio River Valley, they formed a wall of resistance to further pressure. Resistance fighting began in 1763 and did not end until 30 years later. 1793, when the American forces of General Anthony Wayne, 1745 to 1796, defeated the Shawnee at Fallen Timbers in northwest Ohio. Tecumseh was 25 years old at the time of this critical defeat of his people. He became determined, despite the counsel of the tribe elders, to halt the westward movement of the Shawnee. Tecumseh and his brother, Tenskwatawa, c. 1768 to 1834, built a settlement on Tippecanoe Creek near the Wabash River, Indiana. Called Prophetstown, it became a rallying point for those Indians who resisted displacement by colonists. Soon the Shawnee who had settled at Prophetstown were joined by bands of Wyandot, Potawatomi, Miami, and Delaware Indians. The British became aware of Tecumseh's defiance and soon supplied Prophetstown Indians with arms to use against the Americans. In 1810 the governor of the Indiana Territory, William Henry Harrison, 1773–1841, requested a meeting with Tecumseh. But both were suspicious of each other and could reach no agreement for peace. Settlers who were aware of Tecumseh's armed resistance movement pressured President James Madison, 1751–1836, to take action, which he did, under orders from the president. Harrison set out in the fall of 1811 with a force of 1,000 men. Arriving at Tippecanoe on November 6, he met with the Indians under a flag of truce and then made camp about a mile away from Prophetstown. Tecumseh was visiting the Creek Indians in Alabama at the time, trying to rally their support in the white resistance movement. But his brother, Tenskwatawa, rallied the men at Prophetstown, and at the break of day, they attacked Harrison's camp. Hand-to-hand fighting ensued in an icy drizzle. The Indian alliance retreated, and though Harrison took heavy losses, he had managed to destroy Prophetstown. The battle undermined Tecumseh's initiative and launched the career of Harrison. In 1840, after successful military duty and service in the U.S. Congress, Harrison rode a wave of public support all the way to the White House to become the 9th president. His campaign slogan was Tippecanoe and Tyler, too. John Tyler was his running mate. Eventually the Shawnee were pushed into Kansas. Tecumseh became an ally of the British in the War of 1812–14, and was killed in the fighting.
Who invented the telephone?
For more than 100 years Alexander Graham Bell, 1847–1922, was credited with inventing the telephone. But in 2002 the U.S. Congress officially recognized a previously unknown Italian-American inventor, Antonio Musi, 1808–1889, as the father of the telephone. Musi was born in Florence, Italy, and arrived in the United States in 1845. His focus was the use of electricity in medicine. But in carrying out his experiments, he realized that the voice could be transmitted over wire. By 1862 he had developed dozens of models of his invention. but could not afford to protect his prototypes with patents. In 1870, illness forced the poor inventor to sell his early models. By 1874 he had assembled new models, which he gave to an executive at Western Union Telegraph Company. 2 years later, the announcement was made that Scottish-born inventor Alexander Graham Bell had pioneered the technology. Bell came to the United States in 1871 as a teacher of speech to the deaf. He believed that sound wave vibrations could be converted into electric current at one end of a circuit, and the current could be reconverted into identical sound waves at the other end of the circuit. He had described this idea to his father as early as 1874, and some believe that he may have conceived of it as early as 1865. Still, Mussey's prototypes would have predated these ideas. On June 3, 1875, while trying to perfect a method for simultaneously carrying more than 2 messages over a single telegraph line, Bell heard the sound of a pluck spring along 60 feet of wire. In 1876 the first voice transmission via wire was made when Bell had a laboratory accident and called out to his assistant, "Watson, please come here. I want you." Thomas Watson. 1854 to 1934, was on another floor of the building, with the receiving apparatus, and distinctly heard Bell's message. That same year, the Bell telephone was patented in the United States and exhibited at the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition. Mussey died in poverty in 1889. His recognition as the father of telephony was the result of persistence on the part of Italian Americans who wished to set the record straight. In fact, in 1871, 5 years earlier than Bell's first voice communication, Mussey had secured a certificate stating his paternity to the invention of the telephone, which he called the teletrophone.
What did President George H. W. Bush mean when he said the U.S. had to draw a line in the sand?
President George H. W. Bush, 1924, was reacting to Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein's 1937 act of aggression when on August 2, 1990, his troops invaded neighboring Kuwait. The United Nations, UN, gave Iraq until January 15, 1991, to withdraw from Kuwait. Iraq failed to comply. The line in the sand that Hussein crossed was soon defended. On January 16, 1991, Operation Desert Storm was launched to liberate the Arab nation of Kuwait from Iraq, whose military dictator had not only invaded Kuwait but proclaimed it a new Iraqi province. Bush averred, "This will not stand," and in order to protect U.S. oil supplies in the country, the president mobilized U.S. forces, which were joined by a coalition of 39 nations, to soundly and quickly defeat Iraq.
How old is Taoism?
It dates back to the 6th century B.C. when it was founded by Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu, c. 550 BC. Master Lao, as he was known, believed in inaction and simplicity, which he combined with religious practices to form the mystical philosophy of the Tao, Dao, the path of virtuous conduct. Lao Tzu reasoned that since humans face a cloud of unknowability, they ought not to react to things at all. He viewed the world as a pendulum, with the Tao as its hinge. Anyone who struggles against the current of life is like an insect caught at the end of a pendulum, swinging back and forth, and suffering with each movement. But by crawling along the hinge, Tao, to reach the top, a place of complete stillness is found. Lao Tzu advised that people do away with their desires, avoiding that which is extreme, extravagant, or excessive, and steer clear of any competition. Many of these ideas are embodied in a work usually ascribed to him. Tao Te Ching, classic of the Way of Power. However, modern scholars now believe that tome to be the work of his followers. Taoism is still relevant to many today. When it was developed some 26 centuries ago, the philosophy filled a spiritual void that was not addressed by the practical doctrines of traditional Confucianism. One legend has it that Lao Tzu rebuked a young Confucius, 551 to 479 BC, for his pride. The Tao also contributed greatly to Buddhism, especially in its emphasis on meditation and sudden enlightenment. One of the great thinkers of the Chinese Taoist school was teacher and philosopher Chuang-Tzu, 4th century BC, who constructed a non-political, transcendental philosophy that promoted an individual's spiritual freedom. His self-titled work, Chuang-Tzu, is another classic of Dasein.
What was the first university in the Western Hemisphere?
It was the University of Santo Domingo, founded in 1538 by the Spaniards in the Dominican Republic, which occupies the eastern half of the Caribbean island of Hispaniola.
Why does the music of Bartók figure prominently in concert programs today?
Béla Bartók, 1881 to 1945, is revered today not only for his ability as a pianist. His teacher compared him to Franz Liszt 1811 to 1886, who was perhaps the greatest pianist of the 19th century. But for his compositions, which are steeped in the tradition of Hungarian folk music, Bartók studied and analyzed Hungarian, Romanian, and Arabian folk tunes, publishing thousands of collections of them in his lifetime. While ethnic music had influenced the works of other composers, Bartók was the first to make it an integral part of art music composition. His works were unique in that the folk music provided the sheer essence and substance of the music, lending the compositions a primitive quality. Among his masterpieces are his three stage works, the ballets The Wooden Prince and The Miraculous Mandarin, and the one-act opera Duke Bluebeard's Castle. The introduction of folk music as the core of a musical composition has had far-reaching influence, which must have been felt by American composer Aaron Copland, 1900 to 1990. Whose Appalachian Spring, 1944, features a simple shaker tune, front and center.